going to talk to us about it today. So we're as a department, we're really trying to improve our inclusivity in the fieldwork. So it's really great to have an expert come and chat to us about this today. So I'm sure that lots of things Alison tells us about, we're going to ourselves think about putting into practice. So I'm going to be taking lots of notes of whatever Alison says, and we've got the recording, so I can even look at it later. So on that, I'll hand over to Alison if she'd like to share her screen and start a talk. And at the end of the talk, we'll have a Q&A, so I'll come back then.
Brilliant. Okay, so hopefully that has shared my screen. And thank you so much for that very kind and warm welcome, Joanna. And thank you everybody for coming to listen to my talk today, which is about my research into accessible and inclusive fieldwork. Obviously, when we talk about access and inclusion and EDI, there are multiple factors that we would consider. So just to kind of reinforce what Joanna just said, which is that my talk is specifically about students with disabilities. But I would argue that if we can make fieldwork accessible and inclusive for students with disabilities, then we're actually going to go a long way towards making it accessible and inclusive for all of our students. And just before I get going, I want to clarify how I'm using the terms access and inclusion, because they're often used interchangeably, but they do have subtly different meanings, particularly in an educational context. So when we talk about accessibility, usually what we're referring to is making accommodations or adjustments to an activity that already exists. So it's about reacting to different students' needs. Inclusivity is about working with people to design activities that provide a similar experience for everyone. So the big difference between the two is that diversity is considered before and during the design process so that it's built into the end product. And in reality, there is this continuum between access and inclusion, and it's really nicely demonstrated by this little series of cartoons here, where the three people we can take as being our diverse student cohort. This baseball game is our field trip. The fence is a barrier to participation, and these boxes are our accommodations or our reasonable adjustments. So we can give our students different types of accommodations or numbers of boxes to stand on so that they can participate in watching this baseball game. But if we take away the fence, or even better, we just don't put it there in the first place, then that experience becomes inclusive for everybody. So a key point here is that if you design something inclusively, it should always be accessible for all of your participants. But if you kind of retrofit it to be accessible, it's not necessarily going to be inclusive. But of course, when we're dealing with fieldwork, it's a little bit more complex than boxes and fences, as we'll find out. So just to run through briefly what I'm going to talk about, the first thing I'm going to do is just present the case for why we need to make fieldwork accessible and inclusive. So I'll be showing some data to kind of back up the argument for that. I'm then going to talk about two specific research studies that I've been involved in. The first was where we took a pre-existing field trip and we made modifications to make that field trip accessible. And then the second is where we took the learnings from that first case study and we applied them to designing and delivering an entirely inclusive residential field trip. I'm then going to summarise what we've learned, what I think's changed since we delivered those field trips, and what, in my opinion, still needs to change. So I'm going to be focusing on students' learning experiences and the barriers that our students face. I acknowledge that there are experiences and barriers relating to academic staff that are also a really important part of this whole picture, but that's not something I'm going to be talking about today. I'm just going to focus on the students. And I'm also just going to kind of put out to everybody that I don't necessarily have the answers, and I don't see myself as being here to kind of tell you what I think you should be doing. That's not my place. what I want to do is just share with you some of my learnings and some of my experiences from my research, and then hopefully you'll be able to identify some practices in there that you might want to incorporate into your fieldwork moving forward. And then the final thing is just to say that we've had ethical approval for all of this research. Everybody's given their consent for the photographs that I'm going to show to be used. And when I refer to individual students, I'm using pseudonyms rather than their real names. Okay, so why does fieldwork need to be accessible and inclusive? Well, kind of the big picture scenario here is that globally we know that we're facing a shortfall in skilled STEM professionals, and this includes within the geosciences. So in order to meet this shortfall, one of the things that we need to be doing is attracting a more diverse range of talent into our programmes, and this includes students with disabilities. And we know that fieldwork can be a barrier to students with disabilities engaging with the geosciences. And so this is what we term the pipeline issue. So what we're really interested in is kind of encouraging students while they're at school to want to study the geosciences at further or higher education, and then as they move through this education pipeline to then look to move into a professional career in the geosciences. So at the level that we're working at university, what we're looking to do is encourage more students into undergraduate geoscience programmes. And there was a really interesting study done by Levine et al. Published in 2007 in the Journal of Geoscience Education, which was a critical incident analysis based on interviews with a range of professional geoscientists that tried to identify the very broad range of factors that can influence the recruitment and retention of students into this geoscience pipeline. And one of the critical factors that they identified within this kind of block that sits within degree level education is field trips. So field work is a critical component of the geoscience pipeline at undergraduate level. And what they also identified from this critical incident analysis is that field trips are something that distinguish geoscience education from other types of STEM education, and that having a positive fieldwork experience is something that can be really critical to recruiting and also retaining students within the geoscience pipeline. So what we can take from this is that it's really important to try to ensure that all of our students have positive fieldwork experiences, and I'm going to pick up on this idea a little bit later. So just looking at some data from the UK then more broadly in terms of the landscape surrounding students with disabilities, we can see if we go back almost 2 decades now that we're on this increasing trend in terms of the proportions of students that are coming into higher education and declaring a disability. So in the latest data that we have, it's around about 14.5% of all students in HE that have declared a disability, and it's around about 12% of students in the first year. The caveat here is that this is students that are declaring a disability, and we know that there are a lot of students that don't declare, so this is actually underrepresenting the true proportion. If we kind of zoom in and look at students that are enrolled on physical science programmes, so this is just the data from 2019-2020, what we can see is that the majority of students are declaring conditions that relate to either a specific learning difficulty, so this would be something like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, or a mental health condition, so this could be depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. So this is from a population of around about 11,000 students, and about 60% of this sample have declared a condition that falls under either specific learning difficulty or mental health condition. What's really important from a fieldwork perspective is that these conditions are largely unseen. So if we're out in the field with a typical cohort of students, we cannot tell by just looking at this cohort of students which ones might have these kind of conditions. Okay, so that's an important challenge that we face in the field. And again, I'll pick up on that later. Why is this important? It's important because the data consistently show that students who declare a disability are less likely than students that don't declare a disability to progress all the way through to the end of their degree studies. And the kind of conditions that students declare is kind of related to their non-continuation rate. Where students with disabilities do progress through to the end of their degree, the data are telling us that they're less likely to achieve a first-class degree and they're more likely to achieve lower-class degrees. So they are not achieving as well academically as students that don't declare disabilities. And then when they graduate and they progress into professional employment, they are less likely to move into full-time professional work. So if we just kind of summarise all of these data, what it's telling us is that we have an ever-increasing proportion of students coming into higher education declaring a disability. Within the physical sciences, the majority of these disabilities that are being disclosed are unseen. Students are less likely to complete their studies. If they do complete, they're less likely to gain a good degree, and then when they graduate, they're less likely to move into full-time professional employment. So what this means is that if we don't make our undergraduate geoscience education inclusive, what we're doing is putting students with disabilities at a disadvantage in terms of their ability to succeed and to kind of move through the geoscience pipeline. And fieldwork is a major component of geoscience education. So if we're aiming to make geoscience ed in general accessible and inclusive, then this kind of has to include our fieldwork. So in terms of the main barriers to fieldwork that students can encounter, they fall into two broad categories. We've got our physical access and logistical barriers. So the kinds of things that we're looking at here would be to do with physical mobility and students' ability to negotiate round different fieldwork sites. It's to do with issues where we remove students from familiar environments and environments in which they have support structures to kind of help them cope through everyday challenges. It's about needing to make significant adjustments to everyday activities while they're in the field and providing support with activities like reading, note-taking and organisation. But a really key aspect of fieldwork that I think has been overlooked in a lot of previous studies is to do with social inclusion, because learning is a social process, and particularly when we're learning in the field. And there's a really excellent paper that was written by your peers at Imperial College, Mike Struhl and Lorraine Craig, which looked at and discussed the value of social learning theories in terms of fieldwork design. Because what we're doing when we're in the field is trying to help our students navigate this pathway between being a novice geoscientist through to becoming a professional. So it's about cultivating their identity and helping them to think and practice like a professional geoscientist. So what we're interested in this fieldwork is how it can help to foster this kind of social interaction and generate connectivity among both the students and between students and academic staff. Okay, so to help build these communities of practice. So the first case study that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to kind of go through this one fairly briefly, is the Sea to Sky Highway. So this is based on a one-day field trip that was developed initially by Brett Gilley, who is at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And what Brett did in collaboration with the International Association for Geoscience Diversity is to take this one-day field trip and then modify it to make it accessible for students with a range of disabilities. So this is an example of taking something that already exists, looking at the cohort of students that are going to be participating, and then thinking about what adjustments and modifications need to be made in order to make it inclusive for those students. So the aim here was to conduct a completely accessible field trip where students with disabilities and academic staff could work together to help define inclusive methods of field instruction. So this took place in 2014, and it was part of the suite of field trips that was run for the 2014 GSA annual conference, which happened to be in Vancouver that year. And it was delivered very much as a kind of workshop style of field trip where we visited a number of locations over the course of the day, and the students and academic participants were working together. And the activities were based very much around observation, discussion and discovery, rather than like detailed and specific data collection. So over the course of the day, saw lots of different exciting types of geology. So looked at examples from coastal processes, geohazards and engineering, and some igneous and glacial processes as well. So a lot that went on during that day. And in terms of the research that I was involved in carrying out, this was carried out with in collaboration with my colleague Anthony Faig, who's at Central Michigan University, and we were very much looking to get some insight into the lived experiences of both the students and the academic staff who were participating in this very different type of fieldwork activity. So we were interested in questions around the design of the fieldwork, how effective this fieldwork is in developing these social interactions and building these communities of practice, and also about this idea of encouraging and developing self-advocacy. So letting students become confident and comfortable about making their needs known and being comfortable about speaking up for themselves and for others. So we were collecting very qualitative data. We were talking to people, we were observing people. So we had focus groups and we had in situ observations. In terms of the participants, we had 15 students. So this was a mix of undergrad and postgrad. 14 of those students at the beginning of the field trip self-identified as having either a physical, a neurodiverse or a mental health condition. And by neurodiverse, what we mean is we use that term to refer to differences in the way that the human brain functions. So it's typically used in relation to conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. And we also had 14 academic staff, 3 of those declared a condition as well, and 2 support staff. So within our participant cohort as a whole, we actually had 60% who identified at the outset as having a disability. Interestingly, at the end, that number increased. So with my remit of researching the student experiences, one thing that I was really interested to get a handle on was their prior experiences of doing fieldwork. And this is really important because your prior experiences of something will influence your attitudes and your expectations if you go on to repeat that particular experience. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If you go to a restaurant, for example, and the food's rubbish and the waiting staff are rude, you're not necessarily going to want to repeat that experience again in the future. And it's a similar concept with fieldwork. If students go into the field and they don't have a positive experience, that can influence their attitudes and their feelings towards their future fieldwork experiences. So when I talk to these students, Their prior experiences were not universally negative by any means, and a lot of what they talked about was very positive, and they'd had some very good fieldwork experiences. But nonetheless, there were certain themes that seemed to be reoccurring and certain phrases that kept popping up that said something quite important about the kind of things they'd previously encountered. So they talked about fieldwork being daunting. It was something that they didn't necessarily look forward to. They felt that on previous fieldwork they had been perceived by other people as being lazy, as being something of a burden, that the conditions that they were living with and that presented them with the challenges they were trying to overcome were misunderstood. And because they were misunderstood, they felt unsupported both by their peers and by academic staff. And there was a real sense that they had felt socially excluded on previous fieldwork. And this really came out in terms like, I'm always at the end of the queue. I'm always the last guy back at the bus. Yeah, I'm always the one that's trailing behind, this feeling of just not being included with everybody else. And this is really important for us to know when we're trying to design and develop inclusive fieldwork, because these are the kind of feelings that we need to try to address when we're putting together our field activities. Okay. So as I said, there was a really strong focus within this field activity of trying to build social connectivity. And so the way that the field day was organised was we started off by pairing up the students with a member of academic staff. Now, this is obviously not something that we can do ordinarily on our field trips, but because of the way this field trip had been designed and developed, we were able to do this. So we had buddy pairs. And what this meant for the student was that from the very outset, they had somebody that was more knowledgeable than them, that could guide them in their learning, in their discussion, that was looking out for them, and that they knew that they could talk to. And then the idea was that as the day progressed, we would see kind of a ripple effect as they moved from just working together in their buddy pairs through to kind of collaborating more broadly within the whole cohort. Now, this isn't rocket science. It's something that we observe pretty much every time we go on a field trip, and it's something that, you know, we would reasonably expect to see. However, what we need to bear in mind is that we're dealing with a group of students who typically have felt excluded in their fieldwork. So what we were really interested in was, with this group of students who have typically felt excluded, are we going to see a similar effect? Are we going to see them building this learning community and starting to integrate and collaborate with each other? And that's exactly what we did see. So that was a really fantastic thing that we kind of observed happening. So yeah, we saw them moving from these buddy pairs through to starting to develop a much more cohesive learning community. In terms of physically accessing the geology, we were very clear that it wasn't about getting every single participant with their nose up to every single outcrop. It was about enabling all of the participants to engage with the geology and with the learning that was taking place at each of the localities. So the way that this fieldwork was designed was to offer the students, or all of the participants, multiple means of accessing the geology. So in this particular example here, we had the bus parked in a very flat parking area. This is in a national park with a very clear vista out to like the regional geology and the kind of the features of interest. So students could choose to stay back in this very flat, accessible parking area and have their buddies or other members of the group actually go and collect hand specimens for them and bring the geology to them. Or depending on how confident the students felt they could choose to actually walk down this track and get closer to the outcrops. Yeah, and just basically choose how they wanted to access the geology. So it was about offering multiple means of access and giving the students that element of choice. And everybody was equally included, and everybody's choice was accepted as being valid. As well as physically encountering accessing the geology, we also know that students can encounter barriers with our learning resources. And a lot of this comes because we tend to think of geology as being a very visual subject, and it is. You know, it privileges the sense of sight. It's very much about making observations, about looking at things, but it's also very multisensory. If we think about all of the other senses that we can engage as well, you know, so we chew bits of rock, and we do engage more our other senses, I think, more than we realise. But when we're working with students with disabilities, we just need to be a little bit more thoughtful, I think, about how we create our learning resources so that we speak more explicitly to that. So in this particular example, our written handouts were perhaps more detailed than they would ordinarily have been. We had audio guides, and we had some visually impaired students, and so we created these tactile maps. And the idea of these tactile maps was that the different regional geological units were represented in kind of different textures. So we had one that was represented using different types of sandpaper to represent the regional geology, and then another one that used this kind of puffy paint type of effect to put different patterns on the map. And this was something that our visually impaired students kind of really appreciated. It gave them a sense at each of our field locations of where they were situated in relation to the broader regional geology. So that sort of thing worked really well. So when I talked to these students after the fieldwork and tried to get a sense of what they'd taken away from this experience, bearing in mind some of the things that they'd said beforehand, one of the main differences was that they felt that the pressure was off. Because they knew that this fieldwork had been kind of designed with accessibility in mind, there was less pressure for them to have to keep up with everybody else, and less pressure for them to have to perform at some perceived level of ability. And that made everything feel much more comfortable and also much more inclusive for them. So they did feel that everybody was included, and the way in which the social interaction was facilitated played a huge role in this. In terms of the pace, they also felt that taking things at a slower pace than they'd previously encountered was very beneficial for them, because it gave opportunity for discovery and for people to discover and think about things at their own rate. So that again was something that was really helpful. And we also identified this potential for future advocacy. So students being much more confident to actually speak about their own challenges, and also to learn from each other and be willing to speak up for each other. So the really critical outcomes from this were, first of all, for this particular cohort of students, they've had a positive fieldwork experience. So if we go back to this idea of the geoscience pipeline and this conceptual framework with all of its multiple factors, that positive experience of fieldwork that can be so helpful in retaining our students, we can put a tick on that. So that's great. But we also saw the beginnings of a new community of students and academic staff that are now willing to advocate for accessible fieldwork, which was fantastic. So the emergent principles that came from this study that were published in a paper that I led in 2019 were around offering these multiple means of access, about ensuring multiple types of engagement, so thinking about different senses, about being and paying attention to pace and timing, making sure that our learning activities are collaborative, Thinking about academic as opposed to physical rigour. So focus on the learning rather than how many different outcrops or how many different hills the students can run up in a single day. And promoting self-advocacy. So invite students to make their needs known prior to the field activity. So we did that. What we then needed was an opportunity to kind of put this into practice. And we had this opportunity with Access Anglesey. So Access Anglesey was funded through the Inclusive STEM project that was led by the OU, and Plymouth and the University of Leeds were partners in this project. And Access Anglesey was a week-long, fully residential geoscience field trip that was designed and delivered by Jackie Houghton, Dan Morgan from the University of Leeds, again in collaboration with the International Organisation for Geoscience Diversity. And the aim here was to design and deliver an inclusive residential field course for a diverse student cohort. So in this case, we are designing from the ground up a residential field course that we hope is fully inclusive for a diverse range of students. So yeah, it's a week-long course, and Anglesey is a fantastic location because it's quite a small geographical area, but within that area, the students can see a fantastic range of geology. So they got to encounter rocks from the Neoproterozoic through to the Carboniferous, geological settings from subduction zones, sulfides, terrestrial sediments. And over the course of the week, they had quite a meaty task that they were undertaking, which was to take measurements and make observations at these different locations with the overall aim of building up an understanding of the geological history of Anglesey, which is pretty complicated actually. So the aim here was to reflect a more typical undergraduate field trip, so the sort of thing that, you know, we are used to delivering, so that the findings would perhaps be a bit more broadly applicable, at undergraduate level. So again, important thing here is that it wasn't about getting all of our participants to every locality. It was about making sure that everybody was included in the learning experience. So the locations that we visited were chosen because they offered brilliant geology, and like the physical access was kind of a secondary consideration. Okay, so what we were interested in was how can we make the learning inclusive for all of our students when we prioritise engaging with the best quality geology that we think we can offer them. So in terms of the research, again, we were very much focused on lived experiences. So what is it like for these students and these participants to actually take part in the inclusive fieldwork? Okay, what are they able to learn? What are the barriers and the challenges? So again, lots of observation, field interviews, focus groups, and also a small number of pre and post surveys. Our participants, in this instance, we had 12 undergrads and a master's student. About half of our students, in this case, self-identified as having a neurodiverse mental health or impaired mobility condition. So about half of our cohort had a disability and the other half didn't declare a disability. So it was very mixed, and again, much more kind of representative of the kind of student cohort that we might be taking into the field. We had a carer companion for one of our autistic students. We had between 3 and 4 participant observers. So these were academic staff from other universities that had joined us to learn and to observe. We had 2 academic staff who were acting as instructors. So that was Jackie and Dan, 2 demonstrators, and a couple of technical support. So what I'm going to be doing in the next few slides is I'm going to be talking through some key aspects of the design and delivery, and I'm going to intersperse this with some data and some student quotes just to give a flavour of their experiences. So in terms of logistics, we stayed at this really fantastic hostel, outdoor alternative in Roscollin. They provided full board, they catered for a wide variety of diets, and they were also able to offer us a quiet room, which was fantastic, particularly for our autistic students, because it was important that they had somewhere quiet that they could go at the end of the day to kind of decompress and to unwind, to just take themselves away from everybody else. We had self-drive vehicles in the field, but we also had a 4x4 which was used to transport our 2 wheelchair users. And what that meant was that with the landowner's permission, we were able to get these students kind of up close to quite a few of the outcrops that we visited. And we restricted the localities that we visited to 1 or 2 on each day. Okay, so it was focused more on spending a lot of time at a smaller number of locations. And then in the evenings, there was an evening debrief, and then the students really had the flexibility to engage with work if they chose to do so. So there were resources available for them to engage with as much or as little as they wanted to. Again, we wanted to find out about the students' prior experiences and how this was kind of shaping their expectations. So one of the things that Jackie did was she actually spoke independently to each of our participants to find out about their expectations and what had worked for them on previous field trips and maybe what hadn't worked so well. And from these conversations, what emerged was that a clear schedule for each day and detailed instructions about what was going to take place in the field were really important. So what Jackie and Dan did with this particular field trip was, rather than prepare one big fieldwork handout, that's the sort of thing that we perhaps would normally do. We'd make one big field book, field trip handout that would cover the whole field trip. They actually created a series of handouts that were given to the students on each individual field day. And each of these handouts was, on the front page, there was this summary of where we're going geographically, so a map of Anglesey showing the locations, where those locations corresponded to in terms of geological time. So they've got a sense of how their spatial and their temporal data was kind of building up. And that was also accompanied by a detailed schedule showing departure, when we're going to arrive at different locations, and also importantly, what time we're stopping for lunch. Now, this might sound like a very small detail, but what emerged from this that we hadn't actually appreciated until we spent time in the field with our autistic students is that it's really important to specify we are going to stop for lunch, and that is the time that you are able to eat your lunch. Because if you don't make that clear, autistic students, there is a risk that they will just not stop and eat their lunch because they're not specifically told that they're able to do this. That was something we didn't know beforehand, so we built that into the schedule. Of course, we had to make clear to these students that there was going to need to be some flexibility. There's always uncertainties, and that's where the little quote in the title of my talk comes from. One thing that's going to be certain is always uncertainty, and when you're going to be working somewhere like Anglesey, obviously the big uncertainty is the weather. So the students were kind of primed, if you like, that here's a schedule, but you are potentially going to need to be flexible at different times. When we got out in the field, the diversity of the cohort meant that we needed to be kind of quite flexible in terms of how we communicated with them. So this is where we experimented with a range of different types of technologies. And one of the types of technologies that we used, which worked really well, was to use a tour guide system. So this is the kind of system that you might encounter on a self-guide tour, maybe in a museum or an art gallery. And we took this technology and applied it to a field trip. So what it meant was that the instructor had a microphone and a transmitter, and then each of our participants, the students, had a little receiver and an earpiece. So the instructor could always keep in kind of verbal communication with the students. It meant that for the instructor, they didn't have to keep continually raising their voice out in the field. They could speak over wind conditions, for example, and the students could also be spread out along an outcrop and still be hearing very clearly what instructions they were given. There was a little bit of an issue with wind noise, so you'll see in this bottom photo here that we just managed to get a microphone protector that just baffled that, and that worked really well. Where this was particularly helpful was for our autistic students, because one of the things that they found really challenging was having to get physically close to other students. So when we say to our students, right, everybody huddle in, they find that very difficult and very uncomfortable. When you use a tour guide system, it means that they can keep themselves a little bit apart, but still hear what's being said. And there's a fantastic quote from Frank here that kind of makes clear how that really helped him to stay engaged in those debriefs. And all of these students here, they're all using the tour guide system to get the debrief. It's a little bit more problematic with our students in the 4x4, because depending on where that was located relative to the other students, they may or may not be able to hear the information being transmitted. If they were sufficiently close to the tour guide system, they could certainly hear what was being said. But at other times we were able to use a walkie-talkie. So if I just pop back here, you can see that in the bottom right-hand photograph, Jackie is speaking both into the tour guide system, but she's also using the walkie-talkie, because that then enables one of our students that's located in the 4x4 to speak back to her. So that's just maintaining two-way conversation. We also had these local area networks set up, which they're quite a simple system, but they do take time. And this is where the expertise from our OU colleagues was really helpful. What they are fantastic for is providing live pictures and sound. So if you just look in the bottom right-hand corner here, what you can see is a live image of what's taking place at the outcrop being transmitted to the student that's sitting in the vehicle, so they can see what is taking place at the outcrop. We also experimented with Skype and FaceTime at one locality where the car was just a little bit too far away to use this local access network. It kind of worked to a certain extent. It's probably the least successful of the things that we trialed, but certainly if you can get a decent 4G connectivity, it is another technique that can be used. So the important thing was that we were maintaining two-way communication with these remotely placed students. And as well as maintaining communication, it's also important that they were kept engaged in the learning activity. So what we did with these students was to develop some parallel activities whereby they had access to photographs of the outcrops, photomicrographs from thin sections, and some polished hand specimens that they could look at and make observations from while they were sat in the 4x4, and then they built up their own independent data set that they could then feed into the broader discussions with their colleagues that had been working at the outcrops. So this was all part of making sure that these students stayed part of, or were kind of included in, this whole group activity. So it was all about kind of ensuring this sense of community. And these hand specimens, thin sections, were all available for the students to engage with outside of the field. We also had some tablets, we had some iPads and some Galaxies, which we took in the field. Most students had a go with them, and there was they were preloaded with apps for geological mapping and for note taking. Different students engaged to different extents, and some students were just perfectly happy to carry on using their notebook and pencil. Where these were really transformative was for autistic students, because what this offered them was an opportunity to engage with the fieldwork and to record information in a way that they hadn't previously been able to, and therefore to make sense of what they were learning in a field in a way, again, that they hadn't previously been able to do. So this was, again, a real learning point from this part of the activity. And these two comments from Callum and Daryl. really illuminate the impact that it had for them. Pace and timing, again, we found, particularly for our neurodiverse student, that this opportunity to spend more time at fewer locations really helped them with having time to process information at a rate that enabled them to make sense of the tasks that they needed to do. And it was also really appreciated by the student cohort more broadly, just that sense of not being rushed, just having time to talk to other people, find out what other people are doing. So yeah, very empowering for our students. Beth here has ADHD, so she really struggled previously with kind of having to pack in lots of different locations in a single day. And again, Frank had real problems with sufficient time to process information, and that was really helpful for him. We know when we take students in the field that they can lack confidence. So what we were interested to know was whether the approaches that we'd designed into this fieldwork had impacted on their confidence in terms of carrying out activities and answering questions. Caveat here is that we do have a small sample size, but nonetheless we did record this increase in confidence at the end of the field trip. So students were more confident about carrying out their activities, and generally they felt more confident about answering questions. Okay, so that was a really positive outcome. And this quote here from Abby in particular just highlights the importance of multiple means of access and engagement in helping develop that confidence. We're also interested in the social inclusion, and there was unanimous agreement among all of our students, both before and after, that it's important for students and instructors to work together. So this is all about building these communities of practice. So this was a really positive outcome. We also found that some of the students felt less excluded at the end of the field work, but some of those feelings of social exclusion did still persist. And this is something that we need to do more work on, because also from talking to students and having really kind of detailed, in-depth conversations with these students, what emerged is that social inclusion is really complex, particularly for students with neurodiverse conditions. And this is both in the field and during the downtime. So this is definitely something that we need to pay more attention to. And I've included this quote from Callum, because Callum had previously been excluded at his home institution from any residential fieldwork with his peer group on the basis of his autism. It had just been considered too difficult. So this was his first ever experience of doing residential fieldwork where he was socially included with a group of peers. And yeah, it was a really transformative experience for him. And we were able to do it. That was a really important thing. In terms of the mobility impaired students, we were particularly interested to know how included they felt, bearing in mind that they had been kind of geographically separated for reasonable proportions of the field trip. And what we found is that technology was hugely helpful in helping them to feel included in the learning in general, particularly the live stream. That was very successful. But the one thing over and above anything else that really made them feel inclusive was getting out to these outcrops and up close and personal with the rocks along with everybody else. That was just the best thing for these students, and some of them had never had that experience before. So what have we learned so far? Good pedagogic practice is key to making fieldwork inclusive and accessible. There's no golden bullet. There's nothing that I'm going to say to you that is just like doing something different than I would imagine most people are already doing. It's maybe just paying a little bit more attention to some of the good practices that we already include. Yeah, everything I think will make fieldwork more accessible and inclusive. Technology and alternative activities are really important, and I think increasingly they are going to have a huge role to play. But the most important thing, wherever we can, is to get all of our students out at the outcrops together and interacting and learning together. There are traditional fieldwork cultures that can be exclusive and persist in being exclusive, both academically and socially. So these are still things that I think we need to be looking at, particularly in terms of maybe physical rigour and some of the cultures, yeah, you know what I mean, some of the broader cultures around fieldwork. And when students feel included, they feel empowered to advocate for themselves and for others. So our students need to know that they have a voice, and that voice will be listened to. And what's really fantastic is that this collective voice, since we did these fieldwork, we ran these experimental field trips, has become louder and it's becoming much more prominent. So over the past few years, what we've seen is this increasing interest and focus on access and inclusion in the geosciences and in fieldwork. And if we just look in the published literature, we see a whole wealth of publications that have emerged that are looking at protected characteristics, that are offering tips for best practice, and that are offering strategies for students with very specific types of challenges and needs. So this is just fantastic. Of course, the big elephant in the room that I haven't mentioned is that also, since we ran Access Anglesey, we've had a pandemic, which hopefully we are starting to move away from. But what the pandemic has done is it has really forced us very critically to look at the way in which fieldwork is delivered and to make very substantial modifications and adjustments to the way that we deliver our undergraduate fieldwork. And almost by default, that new offering has become more accessible and inclusive for a lot of students, including those with disabilities. And this is just a quote from this really interesting paper from Anita Marshall, who's at the University of Florida. She's a disability activist and she's also executive director of the IAGD. And really the main message here is we've made some really important changes to the way that we deliver fieldwork, which is making it more accessible and inclusive. As we move out of the pandemic, what we really need to be careful about as a community is that we don't just cast all this learning aside, and that we take what we've learned and everything we've developed and we kind of embed this in our field practices going forward. So this is my last slide. I think we've made some really fantastic progress over the past few years about making our fieldwork inclusive and accessible. And I think there's still a lot that we've got to learn. But I think we still do have some way to go in terms of attitudes among students, academics, institutions, professional bodies, and the wider community. Because we need to stop thinking, I think, about what our students can't do and what's not possible, and think instead about everything they can do and everything, all of the opportunities that this kind of presents for us as educators. So I'm just going to leave with this very brief comment from Amanda, which really sums up everything I've talked about in the last 15 minutes or so in a couple of lines, which is that anybody that gets into geoscience, regardless of their age or limitations, should have the opportunity to learn and not to be judged. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my work and my findings with you. I've got tons of references that I will share with all of you, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Alison. That was absolutely fabulous. It was an eye-opener for me because I didn't know half of that, and I was particularly interested in the performance of students with declared disability. So in fact they don't perform as well. So we're looking at our data at the moment because we found some of our students don't perform as well as others. So I'm going to add that to the list and see if we got the similar trend, and I'm sure we have, but I'm going to add that. So I have got questions, but I'll open up to the other people first. Victoria, did you sort of come up? Were you going to ask a question there?
I wanted to put my face on the screen because that was so interesting and gave me a lot. Sorry. I found that really interesting. Thanks, Alison. And it gave me a lot to think about in my role where I am communicating about our courses, particularly to prospective students. And I wondered what you think that we can do to, or any geoscience department, to encourage that self-advocacy among students or prospective students and to disclose their disabilities?
That is a really interesting question, and there is no easy answer to that. I think one of the things that we need to be mindful about is the way that we portray our subject areas, because if students see images, for example, of geosciences and they see themselves, they recognise themselves in those images, I think they're much more likely to disclose, hey, that's something that relates to me too, and they're maybe a little bit more open towards disclosing that. So I know there's been some really interesting research that's been done into the kinds of photographs that we use to maybe to market and to what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, to basically present our subject areas, and it's about putting across a more diverse and inclusive image of our subjects. I think it's about as well, when we talk to our students, just trying to get across this message that you can talk to us, okay? That we are open to hearing from them. I think it's about making explicit to the students the kinds of accommodations that have been made previously that are open to them. It's about saying, okay, we're going to go to these particular locations. These are some of the challenges. These are some of the ways that we are going to address those challenges. Yeah, it's a really difficult one.
Thank you.
So, Alison, you popped up. Were you going to ask a question?
Can I ask one? You referred during your talk about pressure, and I completely agree with that. If you try to put out the pressure from the students, they will better enjoy what they are doing, and if they better enjoy, they will better learn, definitely. And for me, from my experience, there are two main things, one that you have mentioned, one that you haven't mentioned about the pressure. The one that you have mentioned is pace and timing. And I completely agree. It's something maybe we can try to work on, because it's quite easy to do. It's just to select less outcrops than what we usually do, because it's true that usually it's quite intense. And it's really often, from my experience, and not only at Imperial, that when you leave the outcrops, the students are a bit like stressed because they haven't really finished, but we have to leave because there are still 3 or 4 outcrops to do in the day, and we can't work too late. Yeah, then it's night. So this is one thing that we can quite easily do, and you mentioned it. The other thing that we all see, I think, by experience, is about assessment. And you haven't spoke at all about assessment, but our students, and I've seen that everywhere I did fieldwork, are strongly stressed and anxious about assessment. And just a quick question about that: were the fieldwork that you presented assessed at all or not at all? And what do you think about assessment? Do you think that it would work to have fieldwork that are not assessed at all, or with a lower degree of assessment? I don't know.
Oh wow, there's a question, Valentine, isn't there? Okay, so we obviously didn't assess the Access Anglesey field trip, but as part of the data collection, we did specifically ask the students about this whole issue of assessment, and so it's just something I didn't have time to build into this particular talk. And it was really interesting, because all of the students were saying they really appreciated being able to participate in a field trip without the pressure of being assessed. And that took away, yeah, that word pressure has just automatically popped up there, hasn't it? That because they weren't being assessed on the learning that they were doing, they felt that, and this is all of the students, not just those with disabilities, they took the opportunity to, I don't know, try out different types of technology in terms of taking notes. try different ways of doing things, work with people they wouldn't normally work with. So just kind of broaden their own experience of practicing different ways in the field and learning with different people. So I think they got a richer learning experience than they might typically get, but without the pressure of being assessed. There is a huge issue about doing field work that isn't assessed, and I think we are all struggling with this. If we don't assess our field work, there is a huge tendency for students just not to engage. I mean, we know this, we see this across the board, and that's one of the main drivers for us linking our field work to assessment. And I think it's one of the things that as a community, there needs to be much more kind of really quite open and critical discussion about is, what is the purpose of our field work, right? Why are we doing it? What are we trying to achieve from taking our students into the field? And we need to maybe frame it more in terms of this overall geoscience pipeline. There is a load that we need to unpack. We did speak to them specifically about assessment, and there is data there that I can mine and kind of talk more about that. I'd love to talk more about it.
So I think I have one final thing. So I was interested that so the Anglesey field trip, you had half the students didn't declare a disability, and I was interested. So I think the answer is yes, but did they enjoy the field trip? Get as much increasing? Were they more positive about fieldwork, just the same as the students who had declared a disability beforehand? So did they also really enjoy the fieldwork more than previous fieldworks?
Yeah, I mean, they really enjoyed it. At the end of the day, they had kind of self-selected to participate in this fieldwork experience, kind of over and above what they would have done at their home institution. So they were already kind of very motivated and wanted to learn. And I think it really helped them to appreciate what fieldwork is like for a broader range of students. So they weren't aware of kind of some of the barriers and challenges that students with different disabilities could encounter. And so it kind of helped them to understand what it's like to learn in the field if you do have different types of challenges and barriers. And I think they really appreciated that. They certainly got to work with a much broader range of students than they had done previously.
So in practice, do you think you need to keep these groups quite small with quite high staff-student ratios? Can you
that's another really tricky one, isn't it? Because we had a real luxury in both of these examples of having a high staff-student ratio, because it was all about scoping out, well, what are the techniques that are going to work? And in reality, we are unlikely to have those staff-student ratios. Again, this is something that as we take, so really what we're doing is identifying principles for best practice. What we now need to do as a community is think about, okay, how do we take these principles and make them work in the context that we need to be operating in? And we need to be operating in contexts where we've got higher staff-student ratios. So how can we actually make some of these things work? If we have the luxury of being able to have a dedicated field support assistant for a student with a particular disability, that's fantastic, and that's almost like the gold standard. There is somebody there to help and support them and to work with them to make sure they stay included. A lot of the time that's not going to be the case, so it's about building up our own understanding and building up that trust and that kind of advocacy among students and academic to ensure everybody is confident to speak up for themselves. It comes back to Victoria's question about, declaring and making everybody aware of, these are my challenges, this is what I'm going to need some help with.
Yeah, okay. I'm looking, does anybody else want to ask any questions of Alison?
I can see somebody's typing.
Oh, Gary Hampson's typing.
Yeah, I have plenty, but it's not really question. It's like discussion, and I'm sure that we will try to arrange a discussion in the near future, Alison?
Oh, I'll be delighted to have a discussion. Yeah.
Yes, I think we need to think about this ourselves. I'm sure we'll. Oh yes, Gary.
Yeah, sorry, I'll stop typing and say it. Yeah, thanks, Alison. That was really interesting. I mean, I'm not sure it's really a question, but more that I think, given that over the last couple of years we've had to rethink lots of aspects of field trips, why we're doing them, how we're delivering them. I think the opportunity is there to sort of think more broadly about it now. And I guess I also I did have a bit of a question like Joe's about resources and, you know, how easy you found it to sort of push to find resources to run the trips you described, and do you plan to run them on a kind of routine annual basis? Is that the next kind of step?
So the first field trip that I talked about, the Sea to Sky Highway, that was funded by the National Science Foundation in America and the Society for Exploration Geophysicists. So they gave the International Association for Geoscience Diversity some funding to develop that field trip. So that was externally funded. The Inclusive STEM project funded Access Anglesey, and ultimately that funding came from what was HEFKE and what is now the Office for Students. So again, that was externally funded. We came out of Access Anglesey saying we really need to try and find funding to offer something like this more regularly, even if it's the kind of thing that we run independently from our host institutions, and just say, okay, a group of us who are experienced in delivering geoscience fieldwork are going to collaborate at a national level and deliver an inclusive field trip. Anybody that wants to come and join us is welcome to. We would love to do that. It's kind of, where's the money going to come from? And those are the kind of barriers that, we need to move beyond that. This again is where I think maybe the pandemic, as crappy as it's been, might ultimately work in our favour, because I think it's making people realise that we do need to broaden the type of delivery that we offer for our students. And so I am hoping that in the future there is going to be more funding available that we can tap into, so that we could design and offer more of these in the future. That's what I'm hoping. I can certainly see some momentum building in that way.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Is that anybody else want to ask any questions? So I think we'll probably wrap up then. Yeah, okay. So I'm sure we're going to come back to you, Alison. I'm certainly going to read some of that, and hopefully we'll be in discussions again then.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again for inviting me to speak to you. It's a real privilege. And Valentine, I'm going to send you a PDF of my slides, and it's got this massive reference list at the end. So please feel free to share that.
Excellent.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alison.